very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate.
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
asked Pilate.
"Yes, it is as you say."
Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things, so Pilate asked him again.
"Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of."
But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now, it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did.
"Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?"
asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead.
"What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?"
Pilate asked them.
Crucify him.
Crucify him.
They shouted.
Crucify him.
"Why? What
Crucify
crime?
him.
What crime has he committed?"
Crucify him.
And they
Crucify
shouted
him.
all the louder.
Crucify him.
Crucify him.
Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away to the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him.
Hail, King of the Jews.
Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff. They spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they'd mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him. And the written notice of the charge against him read,
"The king of the Jews."
They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right, one on his left, and those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying,
So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from that cross and save yourself.
In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves.
He saved others,
They said,
but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe.
those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice,
Elohi, Elohi, lama sabachthani.
which means,
My God, why have you forsaken me?
and when some of those standing near heard this, they said,
"Listen, he's calling Elijah."
One man ran, and he filled a sponge with wine vinegar, and he put it on a stick and offered it up to Jesus to drink.
Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down.
He said, and with a loud cry,
Ah!
Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood there in front of Jesus, heard his cry and saw how he died, he said,
Surely this man was the Son of God.
Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger, and Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there.
So for many, this is a very familiar story. You may not even grew up in the church, but maybe come during Easter, or you've seen a good movie or two. And Mark gives us a portrait of a day. And as we look at this passage, I'm going to try my best to stick with Mark's message. The writer of this book, this gospel that we have been going through from beginning to end, and we're just about at the completion of. And this day actually, remember, the Jewish day begins at sunset. That's when the Jewish day begins. And Mark, so in essence, begins this day in chapter 14, verse 12. He says this, "On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, 'Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?'" So he tells us what the day is. The day that's coming is the day where they sacrifice the lamb. But before that day begins, in other words, before the sun sets, they must go and get a lamb. And people all over the city are going out, and they're going to the temple. They're paying more than they should to buy a lamb so that that evening they can slaughter it and they can celebrate the Passover. And when sun sets, the day begins. And the day begins with Jesus and his closest disciples sitting around a table. And in the midst of this Passover celebration, when they look back on Egypt, when they look back on the 10 plagues, especially the 10th one, where the angel of death came to every single home, and only those who had the blood of the lamb on the doorpost when the angel passed over, that's why they call it Passover. It's in the middle of this that Jesus says, in essence, no longer are we talking about the lamb from then. I am the lamb. I am the lamb. And then Mark begins to take us through this day into the garden, to Jesus' arrest, to his trial. And then in the story that we just heard, he picks up early in the morning. Now, it was in daylight that a judgment had to be made. So that's why it says in daylight the Sanhedrin probably takes another vote. They've already tried him. They found him guilty, but they've got to at least have the semblance that they kind of follow their own rules. So they wait till daybreak. But as soon as there is first light, early in the morning, they cast judgment. Now, anyone who's paying attention to Jesus knows what happens next. Because Jesus had already told them earlier in the book of Mark, he told his disciples, not only am I going to be betrayed and rejected by the religious leaders, but they're going to hand me over to the Gentiles. And sure enough, they take him to Pilate. Now, there's this twofold. A, they technically didn't have the right to kill anyone for a capital offense, though they've exerted that right in certain instances. And as the religious leaders, they probably could have got away with it, but this is a political issue. So it's much more expedient if Pilate takes care of the problem. And so they bring Jesus before Pilate. And the interesting thing is, Mark really, he doesn't, we don't have the sending to Herod and the coming back. We don't have a lot of detail. Mark has a singular point here in his description. His singular point is this: the lamb is without blemish. Now, I'm talking about the first Passover. When you grabbed the lamb, it had to be without blemish. And what we see here is that the lamb is innocent. And Pilate asks him one question. Listen, they're charging you with, you haven't committed a crime, you didn't steal anything, you didn't murder anyone, you haven't committed some, they're accusing you with being the king of the Jews. Now, this is an interesting charge because it is one that is definitely worthy of death. Absolutely. Because it challenges Caesar's authority. You can almost get away with just about anything. But to challenge Caesar, to usurp his authority, well, that's why Barabbas, we're going to find out later, and the insurrectionists who are trying to overthrow the government are heading for the crosses. But Pilate sees through, we see in the scripture. Pilate understands what's going on here. This is not a man who's committed a crime. This is a man who's got caught up in a political, religious situation. So he asks him point blank, are you the king of the Jews? The interesting thing is this is the one question that Jesus answers again. The only one who could get him in trouble. And he says, yes, just like you said. All the other things that they accuse him of, which Jesus could just answer and get him out of the situation, what does it say? Jesus remains silent. And this impresses Pilate. Why? Well, Pilate has done several of these. And what he has seen is that the most bravest of men will do what they can to get out of the situation. Even if there's a glimmer of hope, no one wants to go to the cross. No one. And Jesus answers the only question that will get him to the cross, and he refuses to answer any question that might be used to save him. A lamb without blemish. But Pilate is caught in a political situation. He's not afraid of the Jews. He's afraid of Caesar. He doesn't mind making them mad. It's evident here by what he does. He doesn't mind making the religious leaders mad, but he cannot afford to make Caesar mad. So he can't just summarily dismiss a charge that somebody's trying to usurp the authority of Caesar. But he also sees that this is a political game, and he does not want the religious leaders to win. So he decides that he's going to use a local tradition to get Jesus off the hook. There's a local tradition that because if you can imagine, all these Jews flood into Jerusalem. It goes from like 100,000 people in the city to some have estimated 500 to 1 million people, at least in the surrounding area. We're not sure of the numbers, but it was massive. And for Rome, it was the most tense. This is why Pilate himself comes into the city during this celebration, to let them know that Rome is ready. It's a tense situation. So one of the local traditions that seems to have arisen is in honor of this sacrifice, in honor of this Passover, they would let go one prisoner, usually a political prisoner. Pilate decides to use this, but his idea isn't really to bow and to give something to the Jews to make them happy. His idea is to get Jesus out of this. Now, I have an older sister. She and my mom devised this plan. She would go to the mall with mom, and they would find an outfit that she really liked. And Dad might find it a little questionable. So what they would do, of course we learned this after the fact, is they buy 2 other outfits they knew that Daddy wouldn't like. And they lay all 3 outfits out, and they say to him, Daddy, which outfit do you pick? And lo and behold, he usually picked the one that she liked. That's exactly the strategy that he imposes here. He goes, listen, I got all these prisoners. I'm going to pick the worst one. I'm going to pick Barabbas. Now, obviously, he's the worst one from Rome's perspective because he wants to overthrow the government, but he's not loved by the people either. I'm sure there's other radicals of the time that loved him, but the people didn't. Not only because was he a radical, but he was a known thief. We know he's a robber as well as a murderer. So Jesus basically, Pilate says, all right, if I put this guy up in Jesus, they'll choose Jesus. I'm off the hook because I said he was guilty, and yet I gave him to the people according to local tradition. We're good. But what happens is that he underestimates the hatred and, by the way, the influence of the religious leaders. And they choose Barabbas. They choose Barabbas. But in one last-ditch effort, see, this is Mark's message. Mark's message is he's innocent. In one last-ditch effort, Pilate says, well, then what do you want me to do with this Jesus? In other words, okay, you pick Barabbas, I'll give you Barabbas. But maybe there'll be some sanity among the crowds. I mean, after all, when was the last time the Jews called for the blood of a Jew to a Roman? What would you have me do with Jesus? And they say, crucify him. And he's even asking for a reason, like, why do you want him dead? But all they can do is yell, crucify him. Kill him. The innocent one. You remember the trial that we talked about last week? He was basically declared innocent. He did the one thing to get himself in trouble. The trial that we sing this week, he's basically be declared innocent. And yet he ends up going to the cross by his own doing. And that's Mark's message. And then Mark shifts. This is all happening. It says early in the morning, probably happened at first light, let's say around 6 a.m. We don't know for sure because it works on when the sun comes up. But after this trial, he is turned over to the soldiers. And then we see them do what soldiers will do. Now, you got to understand the mindset of a soldier. It's hard for us to do. A lot of times we see soldiers and they're accused of doing certain things in foreign lands and our stomach turns. But you kind of have to know the whole story. It doesn't make it right, but you got to understand the whole story. These guys they've pulled duty here in Jerusalem. They are on high alert. Because of all of Rome, in all of Rome, the one duty you do not want is to watch any region that the Jews are in. Because they are stubborn, thick-necked people that won't get with the program. Everybody else, when they've been conquered, everybody else, they've been able to say, listen, you can keep your culture, just pay homage to Rome and we'll be good. And everybody else has pretty much stayed with the program, but not the Jews. They are a constant source. They are a constant headache. And this, like I said, time of the year where all these crowds swell, these soldiers know one little thing. One little thing. They bring in the wrong thing into the temple, or they say the wrong thing about their God, and these Jews could just go. Now here's a Jew, and the word has gotten around. It says they bring in the whole Roman guard. The word has gotten around that this guy's claiming to be not just a Jew, but the king of the Jews. Now they can't do anything out there. But now they got this one Jew. This one representative. He's supposed to be the head of them all. And all that tension, all that hate, all that contempt for these religious zealots are poured out onto Jesus. And they mock him. And from here on, we're just going to see this theme here. They mock him for who he really is. But to them, it's a joke. To them, it's a joke. So this idea of being a king is a joke. So they create a crown. They put purple on him, which is a symbol of royalty, and they pretend in a mocking way to worship him as they spit on him and they beat him. After, by the way, they flogged him. Now, it's interesting. Mark's message here isn't the suffering of Christ in terms of he doesn't describe the scourging. As a matter of fact, it's one little sentence. He doesn't describe this process. His point here is that they're mocking the King of Kings. That he's suffering shame, and his strength and his innocence is contrasted with the hate and the abuse and the violence around him. That's Mark's message. That's Mark's message. And then he is sent out, it says, simply. He's to go out. And there's an interesting thing here that's really easy to miss. As he goes out, he's supposed to carry his cross. Now, the Romans had you carry your cross because it was the symbol of your guilt. The interesting thing is Jesus ended up not having to carry his cross ultimately because it wasn't his guilt that he was going to carry. It's interesting that another person carried that part. Symbolism. That really it's not his guilt that he's being crucified for. It is ours. The other interesting note here is that the guy who carries a cross is only known as some guy from a certain region. But Mark identifies him as the father of two specific people. In verse 21, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why? Well, the interesting thing, in the book, when Paul writes to Rome, he actually mentions Rufus. These two guys are in the church in Rome. He's saying, those two guys in your body, it was their dad. It was their dad who carried the cross. Again, there's significance there because Mark's just not writing to an audience that doesn't know anything. He's writing to an audience that can go, is that true? Did your dad really do that? This could have been checked out the moment he wrote it. The moment he wrote it, they could have said, are these facts true? And they take him out, and then they offer him an opportunity not to fully experience the experience. That whole idea that they offer him wine mixed with myrrh, that's to take off the edge of the pain. That's to take off the edge of the pain, and Jesus refuses this drink. Jesus refuses this drink. Jesus insists on going to the cross, even though he's innocent, and he insists on the full, horrific experience. The lamb led to the slaughter. And then Mark gives us another detail. Now, this is what happens in the third hour. That was early morning. Early morning, we went from the religious leaders into the Gentiles' hands. An innocent one is declared guilty. And now we come to the third hour, and this is where he begins to describe the crucifixion. But he doesn't describe the crucifixion. There's a sentence, he was crucified. Mark is not interested in the crucifixion. A, they live in Rome. They know what crucifixion is like. But B, that's not Mark's point. What happens in this third hour? First of all, kind of tongue-in-cheek, maybe at the religious leaders, maybe at Jesus himself, a charge is put above Jesus' head. This is typical. Usually would have said for Barabbas, if he had been crucified like probably was planned, it would have said robbery, murder, and acts against the Roman government. What is Jesus' charge? King of the Jews. Notice this thing. King of the Jews, as they mock him. Not only is Jesus crucified, but he is among thieves. He's among robbers. He, the innocent one, is put among the guilty in his crucifixion. And then a litany of people come by. A litany of people walk by. Now, this would not have been unusual. Again, Rome's whole point here is to say, we rule and you don't. What we say goes. And just in case you're wondering what would happen if you kind of press those rules, as you walk into this day into Jerusalem, this crucifixion was already planned. Not with Jesus, but with these other guys. Why? Because this was the day everybody rushes to Jerusalem to celebrate. This is the beginning of 7 days of celebration in Jerusalem. As all these people pour into the city on the road, they want them to see, you better behave yourself. But these people just don't pour into the city and just kind of see this. When then what they normally do is they would curse Rome on the way in, but they don't curse Rome. They mock Jesus. First, just the general crowd passing by, it says, mocks Jesus. The interesting thing is they mock him by saying, you're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself. The interesting thing is the temple, which we know is his body, must be destroyed so he can save them. So the king can save them. It's lucky for them he didn't come down and save himself. In the same way, verse 31, what? The chief priests come. These high and mighty men, these great political religious leaders come and pour, if you would, lemon juice into the paper cut. They add insult to injury. They're like school children. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself because he's not interested in saving himself. Let this Christ, that means Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. Everything else he's done up to this point wasn't enough to believe. You think they really believed if he come down from the cross? They would have just said, oh, Beelzebub, the devil himself helped him do it. Those crucified him then, the third crowd. The guys on his left and in his right also join in and insult him. Now we know from other accounts that one of these guys, after a while, we're not sure when, realizes maybe this guy is who he said he was and asks to be with Jesus. And Jesus forgives him, not just of his robbery and thievery in his life, but of insulting him in the first place. But Mark doesn't give us that detail because Mark's not concerned with that detail. Mark's not trying to give us an historical account. He's trying to give us a portrait of Jesus, the innocent one. The innocent one that believes so much in what he's doing. He puts up with this. He lets it go. This mocking of Jesus. Insult after insult after insult. And then we come across the 6th hour. 9 a.m. would have been the 3rd hour around because the 3rd hour is from sunrise, so it changes. We can't tell you the exact time, but it was around 9 a.m. was the 3rd hour. Now in the 6th hour at high noon, darkness across the land. Now this is interesting because we know that this is at a full moon. So either clouds rolled in or this is an eclipse, which is impossible to have because you can't have a full moon and an eclipse at the same time, just the way that it's all positioned. So for somehow, we don't know how darkness came across the land, but for 3 hours, from high noon to 3 o'clock, it is dark. It is dark. Now, they're just probably freaking out a little bit. They don't understand the weather patterns. Maybe they just think, wow, this is a freak storm. But anyone who understands the Hebrew Scriptures might go, wait a second here. Right before the 10th plague, the Passover, the 9th one, it was darkness. That was the final judgment right before the angel of death came. All throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, darkness is associated with judgment. There is a sense of judgment going on here. This may have been, I don't know, this may have been the thing that, this quietness, this eerie darkness that changes the heart of the other thief that's next to him. But 3 hours, it's dark, it's eerie. And then, what does it say? It says at the 9th hour, again around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out in a loud voice. He quotes Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you, God, is what he's saying. Why? Because for the first time, God's presence is not with Jesus. Why? Because my sin at that time, maybe for 3 hours, I don't know, But at that time, my sin and God's wrath on my sin was poured out upon Jesus. And in that moment, God had to withdraw his presence because Jesus represented sin. Mine and yours. And so for the first time ever, he is separated from God. Interesting enough, on behalf of the very people who have passed by and insulted him, from the lowliest, normal commoner viewer, passerby, to the thief, to the religious leaders. And then someone thinking that he calls Elijah, which again is interesting because it's a belief of the Jews that the righteous can call on Elijah in times of distress and he would come rescue him. It's also interesting that Elijah was the precursor of the Messiah. And someone goes and gets him something to drink. This isn't a numbing, this is for thirst. They say, leave him alone, see if Elijah comes down. Like, maybe there's something going on here. Notice the tone is changing. 3 hours of darkness is kind of like, maybe there's something more here. Doesn't dawn on him until that point. Maybe there's something more here. And Jesus cries out, quotes the psalm. And then, verse 37, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Now, this is important. The Roman soldiers and even the crowd have seen multiple of these crucifixions. It's a common thing. Thousands of them. This happens all the time, especially around Jerusalem, because you have a message that Romans want the Jews to get. And it lasts anywhere from 2 to 4 days. That's how long it takes. You actually die of suffocation. Jesus started at about 9 a.m. We're now around 3 p.m. And he dies. It's as if he chose that time and place. That is highly unusual. That's why later on it'll say that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate to get the body, and Pilate was surprised that he was already dead, because that doesn't happen. But Jesus, this whole thing is not what's happened to Jesus. It's something that Jesus has chosen, that he knew he had to do. And even his death, he didn't die at the hand of the Romans. He didn't really die because of crucifixion. He chose to die. He's the one who gave up his spirit. Up to the last. The mighty Lamb of God. And then it tells us two very important things. First of all, it says, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. From top to bottom. That curtain in the temple is most likely the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. It was the division between mankind and God. Only the holy high priest could walk in there once a year. Why? For the atonement of the sins of the people. But when the Lamb dies, when the Lamb sheds his blood, that curtain is no longer needed. Why? Because now when the angel of death comes, it will pass over lives. Not because they've been sacrificed by an animal, which is temporal, but because the Lamb of God gave his life. And just to be clear about what we're talking about, this is how Mark concludes with a centurion, a Gentile. He's seen the darkness. He has seen the bravery of this Jesus. He's most likely, this is the centurion. It tells us the centurion. That's important because the centurion is the commander. Okay? He's not just, it's like if you were thinking about football or some sports, he's not one of the linemen, he's the quarterback. Okay? He's the guy in charge. So he's got a little bit more education, a little bit more understanding. He's processing what's going on here. He's seen how Jesus stood up to the insults and mockery of his own soldiers. He's seen what he's done with all these people that come and insulted him. He sat there for the 3 hours of darkness, which was clearly something that said there's something else going on here. And then he hears this man yell and clearly gives up his own life and is gone. And then the centurion makes a declaration, surely, based on the evidence that I've seen, surely this was the Son of God. Now, what we don't know is, was he really saying Son of the God? Because in Roman culture, there was many gods, and their children, kind of like demigods, would come and live among us. This is one of the things that we'll find out in other Gospels that freaked out Pilate and his wife so much. It's because he actually thought that maybe he was one of the gods. One of the reasons he wasn't anxious to put him to death. But Mark's audience that he's writing to, they know exactly what Mark is saying. This guy is declaring, whether knowingly or unknowingly, this Jesus wasn't just Messiah, but he was God's very Son. The interesting thing is, we see this term Son of God only mentioned 3 times in the book of Mark. It starts out, verse 1. This is about Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. The second time is Mark chapter 3. And that's where an evil spirit who lives in the heavenly realms that would know what God's Son looks like calls him the Son of God. And then nothing until the centurion sees the way he dies. Not a miracle, not great wisdom. He sees the way he dies and says, this is the Son of God. This is the Son of God. Now we're gonna get to the women at the end of the passage, but I think we'll wait till next week to talk about them. It's very, very important. The interesting thing here, though, is that what Mark is trying to communicate to you and to me isn't, man, it's horrific, this great death that Jesus went through, though it was. He's trying to communicate, A, he's innocent. B, he chose this. C, that his righteousness or his goodness, his love is drastically contrasted by the whole world around him. And his ultimate conclusion of all this is, Jesus is divine, who purposely did this. He is the Passover Lamb. He is our Passover Lamb. It's all about grace. You know, my theme for Mark is that Jesus is the Messiah, which was expected, the Messiah, but unexpectedly, he's the divine Son of God, who came to be not to be served, but to serve. That's his message. That Jesus, who's the Savior that we've been waiting for since Genesis chapter 3, has arrived. But he's also, what we didn't know, the Son of God. He's God himself in the flesh. And even more surprisingly, he didn't come to be served. He came to serve, which is exactly what you see in his death. He's not a victim of anything. Even in his death, he's a conquering hero. Why? Because he came to save. Not himself, because he didn't come to serve himself. He came to serve us. He came to serve those who insulted him. He came to serve the Roman government. He came to serve the religious leaders. He came to serve the criminals on his right and his left. Grace. He came to give us what we do not deserve. Romans chapter 5, 8 through 11, it'll come up on the screen, says this. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. This is how God demonstrated his love for us. while we were still sinners, not when we cleaned up, not when we finally decided to go to church, not when we finally decided we were going to live good, but when we were at our worst. Think of your worst moment. Maybe you hit a child. Maybe you betrayed your spouse. Maybe you stole something, or in the face of great love of someone, you shook your fist in their face. Think of your worst moment, because it was at that moment that Christ died for us. Not your church moment, not your recovery moment, not your I'm finally going to get my life together moment. At your worst moment. At the insulting Jesus moment. At that moment. Think of that. At that moment. At the moment that you come to the cross and go, you stinking idiot. If you really were God, you would do something miraculous. You would change the situation. I hate you. At that moment, Jesus says, good time to die for you. That's a good time to die for you. Since we have now been justified by his blood. Justified means made right with God. But it wasn't for our blood that was shed, it was his. How much more shall we be saved? Now notice this, save what? From God's wrath through him. This is very important. God didn't just wave the magic wand and say, you know what, you're guilty, you deserve my wrath, my anger towards your sin. He didn't just say, I won't do it. Because that's not really just. Justice is when you do something, you should receive a consequence. That's justice. And God is just. So God's wrath had to be poured out. But here's the good news. It wasn't poured out on you. It won't be poured out on you. It won't be poured out on me. Because it was poured out on Jesus. 3 hours of darkness. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because God's wrath was poured out on Jesus for my sake and for your sake. For if, when we were God's enemies, that's the strong word, that's why I was saying at your worst moment, it's when we were enemies, we were reconciled to him through his death, means made right with God because of Jesus' death. How much more, having been made right with God, restored back in relationship, reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? In other words, how much more, since he's risen from the dead, which we'll get to next week, thankfully, that even in the midst of your brokenness, even in the midst that you continue to make dumb decisions, that we continue to embarrass God by our actions, how much more, though, are we still saved through his life? Not only this so, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received this reconciliation, this being made right before God. This is what I think Mark's first response that he wants from the Romans, from us, from the church in Rome. Love him. Love him. Understand that what he did was love. And when you clearly understand what he did on our behalf, you can't help but go, wow. It's like those war movies that kind of show us what the soldiers went through in Vietnam or the Korean War or World War II. You see the depths of what it meant for them to lay down their lives, and you go, your respect for soldiers goes up a little bit. But what they did is nothing compared to what Jesus did. Because Jesus didn't lay down his life for a country that loved him and supported him. And no, Jesus laid down his life for his enemies. Jesus went to war for his enemies, not to fight against his enemies, for his enemies. You and me. Love him. But there's a second response, I think, that this is required. He's writing to a church in Rome that life is tough. It's tough to be a follower of Jesus. A lot tougher than it is in America right now. And he's calling on them to have courage. If you're familiar at all with your history books, you're familiar with the phrase, remember the Alamo. And the whole idea behind Remember the Alamo is that the Mexican army is coming through, and it was a mission. It wasn't even a place, a fort. stood up against this mighty army, and they were obliterated. But they used that incident, remember the Alamo, to strengthen themselves for the rest of the war, which they ultimately won. And that cry, remember the Alamo, is remember their bravery so you can be brave. Because this little band of 100 or more, not even soldiers, guys, stood up against the vast army. You can have courage too. And in essence, that's what part of Mark's message is. Because that's the last part of the theme. It's Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, the divine Son of God, who came not to be served, but to be served. And my last little bit is, and his followers should do the same. That's whole, remember, because every time Jesus talks about how he's going to suffer and die and rise again, what happens the very next thing? They argue over who's the greatest. And Jesus says, you need to do the same. That's part of Mark's message here. And part of Mark's message is here, have courage. Have courage. Like Jesus, life is going to be tough. Like Jesus, you're going to be persecuted. Like Jesus, you're going to be innocent at times. Not all the time, but at times. And you're going to be trampled on. But don't respond with insult. Don't respond by giving in. Respond like Jesus. Take courage. Love him and take courage to the very end because of what he did. Remember the cross. Remember the cross. And that's really where I want to leave you. I want to leave you in a place where I want you to remember the cross. Not the blood and the gore. There's a place for that. There is. But I want you to remember what the cross stands for. That the Passover lamb, the Passover lamb, the Son of God, God himself, was crucified, shed his blood on the day of sacrifice, because that's the day we're talking about. It started when the sun set and Jesus declared he was the Passover lamb. And the whole early in the morning, it's still that same day, because remember the day starts when the sun sets to when the sun sets the next day. So this is the same day. On the day of sacrifice, Jesus gave his life for you and me. And when the 9th plague came, which was a plague of judgment came, the darkness came, man was not struck by lightning. All the people who insulted Jesus didn't all of a sudden keel over or get boils or flies or locusts. Why? Because all that judgment was put onto Jesus. And because of that, when Jesus breathed his last, he fulfilled God's wrath, which would rightly be on us. And so we are reconciled for him.